Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Stephen Reed, President and CEO of the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, The Missing Link, How Empathy and Clarity Can Unlock Metacognition. This session is brought to you by LD at School, a signature initiative of LDAO. LD at School supports educators across Ontario with practical, evidence-informed strategies to support students with learning disabilities and co-occurring conditions like ADHD. Today's webinar reflects the kind of inclusive, research-informed practice at the heart of our work. For students with LDs, ADHD, and neurodiverse profiles, success in school isn't just about content knowledge. It's about navigating environments that can be overwhelming, unpredictable, and emotionally challenging and demanding. What we often label as executive challenges, like difficulty focusing, starting tasks, or managing frustration, are better understood as gaps in executive skills, shaped by how students experience their learning environments. That's where today's speaker comes in. Dr. Laurie Faith is an assistant professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto. With over 17 years of experience in both special and general education classrooms, she brings a powerful blend of practice and research to her work. She is the creator of Activated Learning, a self-regulated learning intervention, author of Executive Function Skills in the Classroom, and serves as associate editor of Laidlaw Forum. I've had the privilege of working closely with Laurie, co-presenting at conferences, collaborating on research, and seeing firsthand the clarity and empathy she brings to every space she enters. What stands out most is that she models exactly what she teaches, creating environments where students feel safe enough to reflect, regulate, and engage. Her work helps us rethink executive skills and metacognition, not just as cognitive processes, but as emotional and relational capacities we can nurture. When educators respond with empathy and clarity, we reduce overload, build trust, and unlock the strategic thinking so many of our students need. Today's session is practical, research-based, and deeply human. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laurie Faith.
Stephen, thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction. I'm really deeply honored to be here. I'm so grateful once again for this platform and just by the amazingly professional, supportive community that I find at the LDAO. So thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just going to load up my slides. Okay, there we go. So let's begin. This talk is called The Missing Link because I want to connect a few important variables to what we maybe already know about how to support students in achieving goals at school. So you may have heard a talk that I've given before. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is supporting students to achieve their goals using a group metacognitive process that I call the Barriers and Strategies Protocol. And so you can see there's a couple of little artifacts from a classroom here, and I'll show you larger versions soon. But these are just chart papers that are filled with notes that have resulted from big group discussions about all of the things that children are struggling with and the kinds of strategies they can use to be successful. And this is a really feasible whole classroom practice that is extremely promising, that teachers all over Ontario are exploring and finding lots of success with as a way to support metacognition and help children achieve goals at school. But in this talk, I want to zoom in on some of the missing links that allow that process to really work for teachers. So I want to tackle the issue of student frustration during this process, where we might worry that we'll open a big conversation, a nice, warm, metacognitive space with all of the students, and someone will throw some really big or negative or inflamed emotion into that space, that a student will say something like, well, what's hard for me about math? Well, I hate math. That's what's hard for me about it. So teachers often comment that they're worried about opening metacognitive spaces because they're really worried about how students might use those spaces and how hard it might be to bring the group back on track. So that's one of the things that I'm going to address. The other thing I want to address is what happens when students are just so overwhelmed that they don't participate in the metacognitive conversation at all. And so I'm going to start this talk really by clarifying how this barriers and strategies protocol works, why it's a great thing for us to pursue and explore, and then dig into some research I've done around these two factors that tend to stop teachers or deter teachers from being able to use this and being able to feel successful at using this to help students achieve goals at school. So that's really where we're going. So the first thing I want to do is just talk about this idea of goals at school, because there are a few different kinds of goals that students may pursue. Sometimes they're just doing things that are very habitual, that maybe are part of a routine that they do every day at school, maybe some rote tasks. These are a really important part of every school day. Every school day should have a certain, maybe 30 to 40% of everything students do should be comfortable, should constitute just comfortable practice, things that they feel confident doing. But then also we want to include some more challenging tasks that might be really novel, that they need to be super wide awake and strategic to succeed at. And so just to clarify that when we're talking about goals at school, we're talking about a really healthy balance between these two kinds of goals at school. And Stephen, as we go through this, I'm going to actually ask some questions. And we probably don't have time to have a big discussion, you and I, now about these questions, but I wanted to leave them in because I think, if the LDAO community uses this podcast in groups of teachers, you could potentially just stop the video at this point and have a nice conversation as a learning community. And so at this point, it might be interesting to talk about what is the difference for you? What kinds of goals do you pursue that might just feel really habitual, routine, and rote? And can we identify as adults some of the things that just come naturally to us? For me, it's often driving to work, setting up my laptop, maybe doing some basic administrative tasks. But then when I go in to try to write a paper and formulate a fresh argument, that's when I'm digging into the novel tasks I need to be really wide awake and strategic in order to do. And so being wide awake and strategic and tackling novel tasks and new curriculum really challenges executive functions. In fact, this is the time when executive functions are deployed. And so 3 core executive functions are our response inhibition, so our ability to either stop ourselves or stop briefly and choose a better response to some kind of a stimulus, or to control our processing of distractions from inside and outside. So to control our worries maybe, and also to control the way we're focusing on external distractions like phones and other kinds of distractors. The other core executive function is working memory, which of course is not just our ability to hold multiple pieces of information in mind, but our ability to manipulate, work with, maybe compare, integrate those multiple pieces of information in mind at one time. So your ability to hold the idea for what this whole talk is going to be about, and think about that at the same time as you're thinking about what I'm talking about now. And then the last core executive function is flexibility. It's our ability to really dynamically switch between different perspectives or different ideas of how we're going to approach a task. Maybe when we're reading, our ability to look at some letters on a page and flexibly explore the different sounds that those letters might make. And so all of these are called core executive functions. We have tests that we use in research and in clinical settings where we can really tease out each of these specific types of cognitive performance. And we know that these 3 core EFs serve as building blocks for all of the executive skills that we hope students will exhibit in our classrooms. And so all of these things are built from these 3 core executive functions. Emotional control actually isn't really an executive function, but it's a very closely related reciprocal capacity. And so we use a lot of executive functions when we're controlling emotions and managing emotions. And we use our ability to manage emotions when we're deploying our executive functions. So it's often just thrown into the mix. But in general, we use these 3 core executive functions as building blocks for all of these important school skills. So having strong executive functions allows us to do those wide awake and strategic tasks. And that allows us to be successful all throughout our lifespan. So there's an awful lot of research that shows that having strong, well-developed executive functions unlocks all of these positive life outcomes. So it's a very important thing for us to work on in our classrooms at school. So the next question is, of course, how do we help a child build strong executive functions? Well, there's no magic to this, actually. Just like building up any strong muscle, building up executive functions just requires challenge. And so any activity that requires focus, concentration, timing, responsiveness, any activity that is demanding for those core executive functions will build them. But it has to be really demanding. It has to be truly challenging. It can't be one of those rote routine tasks. And so in order to enable students to go to those challenging and difficult places and to sustain their effort and get the practice they need, there are a few really important other things that we need to do in our classrooms. So we need to ensure that these challenges are put in the context of nurturing, of honoring and encouragement. So we need challenges that are genuinely delightful. Children want to do, that are engaging and authentic, that may be meaningful, that may be related to their pre-existing knowledge or their culture or their background experiences. This is the hard work that teachers do to make challenges appealing to children. It's really helpful when those challenges offer some choice and some autonomy and agency. It's really helpful when the challenges that we set are wrapped up in a stance towards the children that is encouraging and empathetic and understanding, and where we're expressing genuine delight and respect for them. And children need to be healthy. Their biological needs need to be met. They need to be well rested and calm. They need to feel safe. They need to be well fed, well slept, all of these things. And so if these things aren't in place, we can offer wonderful, challenging activities. Odds are children are going to hang back and not attempt them. This is what lots of teachers are saying to me about what they're seeing in classrooms. Is that they're setting all kinds of interesting challenges. The students don't seem to be taking them up. And these are some of the things that we can tune up and adjust to increase the likelihood that children will want to engage and will persist in their engagement. It's like, Stephen, when you and I are at home lifting weights and it's a real grind and it's really hard and we put on good music and we look at inspiring posters, maybe work out with a friend. And so these are all the things that we do to nurture our spirits and allow us to persist with that hard work. The other thing we know, and particularly for students with learning disabilities, is that there needs to be the correct challenge needs to be set. So we need to do some scaffolding to make sure that the challenge we're offering is within the child's zone of proximal development. So we need to be careful that there isn't an overload of challenge that's way too hard. And then we see children really hanging back, kind of clinging to the edge of the pool, right? Like kind of hanging back and not trying because it seems way too hard and they're overwhelmed. And so the LDAO community knows so much about all of these scaffolds, but really it's help to understand and anticipate what the task is going to involve, to prepare for the task, all of the things we do to build in a little bit of routine, a little bit of familiarity to enable practice, using visual supports, reminders and check-ins, of course, using assistive tech and all kinds of other accommodations. So we need a nice balance of all of these factors to enable that practice, that heavy duty, hard work that children need to build those strong EFs. But we mustn't lose the most important idea here. And that is that we're talking about nurturing and scaffolded opportunities for challenge, but it's the challenge that maybe is the most important part. And that in our classrooms, we may be masters. Really, the idea of pedagogy, the idea of teaching is all about slowly and steadily building up your repertoire of nurturing and honoring and encouraging and respectful practices, ways to make your lessons interesting, engaging, and scaffold. And we can be really, really skillful at doing this nurturing and scaffolding. But if we're not truly challenging students, we won't build their executive functions. So we have to be careful that we don't over scaffold and pay too much attention to all of the joy and the play and the fun. We have to make sure that it is all in service of the challenge that builds executive functions. So it really is this challenge piece that I think we need to pay close attention to right now. And so it's good to keep in mind when you're thinking about this idea of nurturing and scaffolded challenges, that so many challenges that we set have the potential to build executive functions or not. All of these everyday things, so many things can build executive functions. Remember, it's any challenge that requires timing and planning and managing details. So many things can build executive functions. But if they're not presented in a nurturing context, and if they're not appropriately scaffolded, the odds are children are going to hang back, cling to the edge of the pool. They're not going to get out there and work really hard and try to engage in the activity that you've set. And so I always think about my son learning to do up his shoes. And, for a very long time, my partner and I, we were getting our careers going and we were busy. And there's our little guy trying to learn how to stick his foot in the shoe and do up the Velcro. And we were sort of like rushing him and we didn't have much patience. And there was nothing very exciting or nurturing or fun about it at all. And his frustration tolerance was so low when we were trying to help him. And then we go to his grandparents' house and we watch Adam's grandfather working with him to put on shoes. And it's this wonderful process where my father-in-law is pretending to narrate my son putting his shoe on. And he's saying, well, ladies and gentlemen, here's the amazing Adam. He's got his shoe. What will he do, ladies and gentlemen? His toe doesn't seem to fit. Wow, look what he's done. And so just by adding that little dash of playfulness and nurturing and joy and meaning, and maybe giving him a little bit of scaffolding. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, I think he's got to turn that shoe around. It looks like it might be on backwards. He's giving my son exactly what he needs to persist for a really long time, well past his normal frustration tolerance, and work that muscle, work those executive functions, manage all those details. And so at this point, if you're working through this with colleagues or in a learning community, nice to think through, can you think of activities that you do in your life with your students where you're offering more of that nurturing and scaffolding and less, and what seems to work and what doesn't. So just to make this connection, if we want to do this work of building strong executive function so that our students can chase these wide awake and strategic goals and have all of this healthy long-term success, then we have to do this in our classrooms. So we have to make sure we offer really good, tough challenges, but like a spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down, we have to make sure we're putting these supportive features into our pedagogy. We need to build in all this nurturing and build in all this scaffolding. And really, most goals at school, just like putting your shoes on or going for a walk or helping with dinner, most of the curricular goals at school are great opportunities for challenge that will build executive functions if we add in that nurturing and scaffolding and build up our students' willingness and ability to persist and work hard. So I'm building towards using the barriers and strategies protocol, using those metacognitive conversations. Imagine this goal, completing 6 math questions independently by 11:45. So I watched a classroom full of grade 3, 4 students do this on day 1, and there were a lot of kiddos hanging out by the side of the pool, not even trying. There were a lot of frustrated kiddos, and the teacher was sort of like throwing her hands up, saying, I don't know what's wrong. These are kind of right at their level. I feel like they can do this. It's not so hard, but every day I'm asking them to do reasonable tasks, and they don't seem to be engaging. And so the next question is, how can we build all of these things into this task? So that doesn't seem very feasible to do this for every single student. Find meaning and purpose, to engage with them respectfully, to figure out how to scaffold in a way that every student really needs. And as teachers, we present all kinds of different challenges every day. And of course, we read the IEPs, but it's hard to remember in the spur of the moment exactly what every student might need for all these different tasks that we set. It sort of asks us to have a kaleidoscopic understanding of the task and the children. And now we're doing math, but then we're doing reading, and then we'll be doing writing. And the nurturing and the scaffolding that we need to offer at all these different times in our day is changing like one of those rainbow kaleidoscope patterns. It's very, very difficult, maybe not even quite feasible. And the research reflects this, that most teachers feel like they don't have the time in their day to support students towards self-regulated learning, to support them with all of the most appropriate scaffolds and the most appropriate nurturing and encouragement. So what can we do? Well, this is the feasible little solution, this socially shared discussion. Call it the barriers and strategies protocol. We do it with whole classes of students all at one time. So you're not taking your wheelie stool next to every single student, having individual conversations, but you're just opening a big group conversation with the whole bunch of students. So we've got like a chart paper here, or we've written it on the board or on a smart board, and we're saying, okay, we're going to try to do independent math questions. What barriers do you think we're going to come up against? Let's talk through what might be hard, and then let's talk through all kinds of strategies. And so at this point, it would be interesting for a team of teachers to kind of stop the video and think about, like, what do you think the students might have said in grades 3 and 4? What would their barriers and strategies be? So here are some of the things that they ended up saying. And in this conversation, the teacher learned an awful lot about how the students were experiencing this particular task. It's almost like a mini IEP where we're understanding what's difficult for the students, maybe what they already know, maybe some of the strategies that have been useful, some of the accommodations that they might like to use in engaging in the task. And the students are having an opportunity to hear all of this from each other and to learn to be strategic from each other, but also to learn to be self-compassionate from each other. Hearing, oh, I don't need to feel badly because certain elements of this task are challenging for me. So breaking down some of that stigma as they're hearing, oh, some of my classmates struggle too. So it's not so strange that I struggle. I don't need to feel shame. I don't need to feel isolated or alone. We're all here to help each other. And really, this is how humans are meant to function in groups together. We were built to function in groups. And so this can be really wonderful. And when we think about all of the different ways that it is nurturing and scaffolding, begin to suspect this might be a really nice, feasible way to build executive functions, to help to nurture and scaffold students through these tasks. We can talk to them about how they feel about the task. We can elicit their gut reactions. What are your barriers? Maybe they're saying, I'm really nervous about math. I feel really uncomfortable. Maybe some strategies will be to find ways to make it more delightful and engaging. Maybe they're going to talk about working in partners or having a pep talk together or throwing away the thought. So some of these things they may have learned over years. Maybe they've been in in tier 2 or tier 3 teaching and learning situations where they've had some expert advice and some support. Maybe they've had great conversations with caregivers. All of that knowledge and insight and strategy can come into the classroom. We can ensure that the challenging includes some choice. So if students are saying, I'm not sure how to show my thinking, we can talk through a whole bunch of different choices for how to show their thinking. And we can, as teachers, we can take on that pedagogical knowledge. Oh, they're not too sure about this element of the task. So we can go through and troubleshoot some of their challenge areas. We can do this work of helping them to understand and anticipate the task. We can offer them some visual support in terms of like a nice big list of things that they could try, give them lots of reminders about what they should be focusing on, and really identify all the different types of accommodations that they might need and give them all the encouragement. It's an opportunity to express empathy and understanding, and just tune in to how the students are experiencing the task. So sort of like a mini IEP right there, 5-minute practice, just a quick conversation before they get going. So this is the metacognition that I really think is important and is so promising in classrooms. There's lots of research on this idea of socially shared learning regulation and how it may be much more feasible. In my experiences and in my research, it can be a real game changer in a classroom. Here's another example. Students talking, these are very young students, grade 1 students, trying to be more successful with their supply teacher. And their regular classroom teacher just had, before she went off on her PD day, had a really good metacognitive conversation with them about what are we going to do, what's hard about this, and what can you do to be more successful. Once again, all kinds of nurturing and all kinds of scaffolding available here. Here's another one in a grade 9 class. They were working on power laws, I think. And here is a teacher. That's actually a video of me. It's a screenshot from a video. The students were talking all about all of the things that are troubling them, that they find difficult, and then sharing just some preliminary strategies. We can do this. We can do this every day for 5 minutes. So each individual interaction doesn't have to be perfect. We can just touch on a few strategies and then come back to it the next day, come back to it at the end of class, talk about what worked. And so this socially shared learning regulation is a wonderful way to incorporate self-advocacy, metacognition, problem solving into our everyday classrooms. But how can we really make it work? So extremely promising, but teachers do worry when they open these group conversations, what's going to happen if somebody shares something a little bit salty? What happens if someone says, my difficulty with this is that I hate math, or I'm never going to be successful, or even something like, my problem is that you were away all last week, my teacher, and I wish that you weren't away and I'm feeling angry. So students say all kinds of things when we open big metacognitive conversations. And if we don't have the skills to manage that frustration and some of those negative feelings that are shared, it can be a really good reason just to avoid those metacognitive moments and to not engage in a close conversation with a student or students, but really to become estranged from them. And we actually want to come into closer relationship with our students. We want to know our learners better, and we don't want to be afraid of anything they're experiencing at school. Well, it turns out there's a really wonderful tool that really resonates with a lot of teachers for how to handle these emotional moments, because teachers worry, what if we get big emotions? So I want to just back up a little bit and share some science on just the regulation of emotions. So in general, there's a model for how emotions get regulated. It's a 4-part model. So experts believe that sometimes we regulate emotions by just modifying the situation that we're in. So if Stephen is really frustrating me, I can just choose to go into a different room and I can just take a break from Stephen, from my good friend Stephen, for a while. Or I can redirect my attention. So I have this thing where I get really stressed out when I hear loud chewing sounds. So I can redirect my attention from that frustration and calm my emotional reaction just by putting on some music or paying attention to something else, just trying to tune out and not pay attention. And with students in our classrooms, we might say, why don't you focus on something else right now? Why don't you go to a different part of the classroom? So and so is bothering you. We either say, why don't you go to a different part of the playground for a couple of days? Or why don't you just see if you can stop paying attention to that frustrating thing? The other thing we do as effective emotion regulators is just shift the way we're thinking about it. And so if I have a friend at school who doesn't seem to listen to me, my teacher might advise me, you know what? That friend is having a really hard time right now. They've been feeling sick. They're not feeling well. And I think it's making it very difficult for them to pay attention. And so maybe that's why they're not paying such good attention to you. Or, with your friends or even your partners, you can think of all kinds of reasons why frustrating behavior may be happening. And so as adults, most of us are pretty good at using these emotion regulation approaches. They all kind of constitute like building a bit of distance between ourselves and the emotion. So not really feeling the emotion, but just moving away from it before it becomes really problematic. This is actually a legitimate way to regulate emotion. It's not something we should stop doing at school. If students have access to it, it's okay to do that. But when a student is in the heat of an emotion, it's when they're really angry. So maybe we're having a barriers and strategies conversation, something's really ticked them off, or it's made them think about how frustrating something is, and they've taken the risk to share some big emotion. Odds are they're in a really emotional place, and they're not really going to be able to do all of these calm, cool, rational avoidance and reappraisal strategies. And so at this point, what we need to do is to help them manage that big emotion that they're in the middle of. And the research talks about this as a modulation. But I want to share a really powerful form of modulation that we can do. So the idea of emotion validation is not new. I'm sure anyone who's listened to a Brene Brown podcast, or it's coming across your social media feed in a variety of formats. If you've ever been to relationship or marriage counseling, you've heard about this. But what we might not know is the very interesting contrast between being validating and being invalidating. The headline here really is what happens when we invalidate and why do we invalidate? It turns out we invalidate for a lot of really good reasons. So here's the difference. When we validate an emotion, when a student says, I'm going to struggle today because I hate math, when we validate the emotion, we don't try to change the idea that was expressed. We don't say, we don't overreact. We don't say, oh my goodness, I can't believe you're saying that. Math is so fabulous. We don't reject the emotion. We don't say, oh, that's not true. You enjoyed it yesterday. We don't criticize. We don't say something like that, something like, well, that attitude isn't going to get you anywhere. Let's try a more positive attitude. And we also don't neglect the emotion. We don't just turn our attention to a student who's saying something more positive and ignore the negative expression of emotion. When we validate, we receive those emotions without trying to change them or suppress them or control them. We may receive them by saying something like, yeah, I hear you. That's fair. And then moving into trying to help them normalize the experience of that emotion, saying things like, I can understand. I mean, most people go through phases of feeling like math is really frustrating. And I think this topic has been tricky for all of us. So I'm not surprised that you're frustrated. Or you might say something like, that's totally legitimate. Math can be really, really challenging. People feel really frustrated. You don't even have to put a time stamp on it, like to suggest that they won't feel angry later. You can just fully validate it and say, That is so understandable. That's a very common feeling. And this whole year of grade 3 or 4 math is really tricky. So I'm not surprised you're feeling frustrated. And express empathy, that sounds hard. When we do the opposite, when we invalidate, we kind of convey to the student that their experiences aren't real, aren't true, aren't appropriate. And this has some profound consequences. But I want to say that we do this emotion invalidation for a lot of really good reasons. We do it because we care about our students and we want to see them out of that emotional pain. We do it because many of us were trained to pay attention to the behaviors that we want to grow in a classroom. And so if we see expressions of emotion often as behaviors, as bad behaviors or unhelpful behaviors, behaviors that may derail the class, then it's very likely that we will want to ignore that and focus on students who are giving us positive and positive behaviors and emotions. So we may say, who's got a positive thought to share about math right now? And so we do this for a lot of really good reasons. We do it with our students. We do it the most with people we love the most, actually. So if you think about your loved ones, maybe your own children, it's very likely that you do a lot of emotion invalidation with them just to try to steer them back into emotional comfort, ease, out of pain. You may find yourself saying things like to a child who says, nobody likes my hair at school. My hair is different from everyone else's and I'm so ugly. You may feel really triggered yourself. You may feel your own feelings of inadequacy and worry, and it's a painful feeling. And you may jump very quickly to saying things like, don't let me hear you say that. You are such a beautiful person inside and out. Let's have a positive attitude. So these are things that we do for our children all the time. Let's talk about why we should steer towards this emotion validation. Firstly, because it is the quickest way to get that student back to a productive mindset. So I'm going to share some science with you. There's lots of evidence to tell us that when we validate emotions, we immediately reduce the pain and the stress and the anxiety that a child or a person, any individual, is feeling very quickly. That it can lead to a better mood and feelings pretty quickly and promote further disclosure because there's a sense of trust. It can support better emotion regulation skills. So down the line, what we want is for children to feel a strong emotion and think to themselves that it is valid. Maybe they're feeling a strong emotion like, I don't feel comfortable with what these peers are doing at this party. We want them to be able to say, of course I don't. That's dangerous behavior. Anyone would feel uncomfortable in this setting. We don't want them to say to themselves, I have an auto setting where I give myself a thumbs up. We don't want them to say invalidating things to themselves. We don't want them to say, oh, you're just being a pushover. You should be braver. It's no big deal. We don't want them to dismiss and neglect and deny their feelings. So this is a wonderful and important emotion regulation skill to build. It also increases their learning and motivation because it gets them on track faster, and it increases their trust in themselves and their own feelings and in others, that they can actually use their words to tell us how they're feeling. Here's what emotion invalidation does. And this set of behaviors and outcomes will be very familiar to anyone who teaches in a typical classroom, because we see a lot of students doing these things. Really having lots of distrust in themselves and in others, not feeling connected to other people and safe, being in an increasingly worse and worse mood and getting angrier and angrier. We know that when feelings aren't validated, there's like a secondary bump of negative emotion that often gets expressed through aggression. So a student that comes into a classroom sighing and looking frustrated and is ignored, or is told, how can you find a positive attitude today? Or what will it take to get you feeling positive about math? Those little micro invalidations might lead next to a big book slam, or a pounding fists on the table. And if they're ignored long enough, it might become more and more and more aggressive. So when I talk to my clinical colleagues, some of whom work with violent offenders, they talk about emotion validation being a response, a very important first response to anger or frustration, and an important thing to do in order to keep yourself safe, because it so quickly calms and regulates the person who's experiencing the emotion. It's the number one first thing to do. So that's the difference between between validation and invalidation. So let's talk about how to do validation in a practical sense. Just using body language, leaning in to show that you're listening, responding to a student's mood and energy level. So if they're a little bit agitated, really kind of reflecting that back and saying, you are so frustrated right now. Oh, that looks so difficult. So really not leaving them all on their own in that emotion. Repeating their words back to them to check that they're understanding, to check that you're understanding what they're going through, and even just to help teach them some emotion vocabulary. So I remember teaching one of my children, he was so upset every day when we were leaving his daycare. He really wanted to go to the subway, and there was nothing I could do to get him to go home without a big tantrum about wanting to go and ride the subway, until I kneeled down in front of him and just said, oh, you are so frustrated right now. You wanted to go on the subway, didn't you? And you're feeling frustrated. And that kicked off a long phase of him using that word. I feel frustrated. This is right after he learned how to do his own shoes up. And we still in our family talk about feeling frustrated sometimes, because he got so much good use out of that word. And then just acknowledging personal history and how it might contribute. So when I was talking to my child about their frustration, just saying, you love going on that subway, don't you? It's your favorite thing to do. Of course you want to go on that subway, and it's so close. It's just across the street. You feel so frustrated that we can't go. And all of these things actually, in just a very tangible, instrumental way, allowed me to get home, to start making dinner with my child. It stopped the tantrum, and it enabled us to move on with our day. These are some validating things to say, and I'll just pop these up, and you can pause the video on these if you want to study them more closely. So I want to share a little bit of research I did on this issue of emotion validation, because I really wondered, is it happening in schools? How much is it happening? Is this a useful tool for teachers who are trying to do these metacognitive practices? How far are we away from being ready to do validation? So I worked with 3 different schools and 46 teachers. It was a great sample because we got almost every single teacher at all 3 schools. So we got a really good representative sample of teachers, younger teachers, older, less experienced, more experienced, teachers who specialized in a wide variety of different subject areas. These were all elementary school teachers. We gave them a scenario of a child expressing some frustration, looking a little agitated, maybe huffing and kicking a chair, but just about a foot across the room, not really doing any harm, but just expressing some frustration. And then we surveyed them as to what they would do. We found some interesting information. So here are some of the things we found. Half of all the teachers described creating some distance, so moving away, either inviting the students to go to the hall or to go for a break, or themselves moving away from the students. So a lot of separating and distancing from that emotion. Talking a lot about moving the students away from what was bothering them, moving them away from upsetting stimuli. And if you're thinking about that model of emotion regulation, you may notice this idea of just getting away, moving away from what's bothering you. So this completely makes sense in terms of an approach for emotion regulation. Then teachers talked about just ignoring it, giving them time to sort themselves out. I wouldn't pay much attention to it. And again, this is what we've been trained to do. We've been trained to pay attention to the students who are behaving positively. or focusing on other students who were doing what they wanted to do. So I think we've all heard a teacher say, okay, when you're looking at a group of students and some are doing what you want and some who aren't, saying, I see 3 students who are sitting so nicely. I see 5 students who are ready to learn. And so this is the kind of thing I see 10 students who look really positive and focused and ready to go. And so really focusing on others. Directing the class's attention away from the angry student. So trying to recruit the class in really kind of ignoring this expression of emotion. Or distracting the student from themselves. So kind of trying to distract them from their experience of emotion, trying to redirect them or act positive or get them laughing or something, just to change the topic for them. Teachers talked about doing reappraisal, thinking about the student's anger differently. Maybe they had a bad night at home, maybe something's going on. They talked about discussing the problem with the student themselves to try to get them to reappraise it. What's going on? Explain what happened. Tell me more. And they talked about trying to calm the class down. So doing some modulation, emotion modulation, regulating, doing some deep breathing, calm words, slow movements. They also talked about trying to calm the student down, the angry student down, giving them some time to calm, maybe telling them to do some deep breathing. What we noticed is that all of these big clear findings fell into this framework of how we regulate emotion. So teachers were definitely attempting to modify the situation, get themselves away from the angry student or the student away from whatever's bothering them. They talked about managing the attention they were paying with a lot of ignoring and distracting. They talked a little bit about shifting appraisal and about actually calming the emotion. So what we saw is that this kind of fit into 3 categories where the teacher was working on their self-regulation. So ignoring to calm themselves down, thinking about the student differently. So trying to get themselves calm so they wouldn't overreact. They were thinking about class regulation. So directing the class's attention away, really worrying about how this is going to precipitate maybe more emotions from the class. And then doing some regulation of the angry student themselves. So that's a lot going on for a teacher. That's 3 different people to try to calm and regulate. So that's a heavy load. The other thing we noticed is that when trying to regulate the class, teachers weren't actually working with the class to try to help them shift their appraisal of their upset peer. They weren't sharing any idea around, I think this student's having a hard moment. They weren't doing much and didn't mention much about their own self-regulation. They didn't talk a lot about taking calming breaths themselves or trying to acknowledge their own feelings about this. And the big thing that we noticed is not one student, not one teacher mentioned using emotion validation. Not one person said, I would reach out to the student and acknowledge them. I would come closer, I would move towards them. So I wouldn't neglect and deny and avoid and ignore. I would actually move towards them, give them a moment of attention and a moment of acknowledgement, even saying, you're having a hard morning or something's going on for you. Like, I think you're having a big feeling. That looks tough. Or I think you had a bad time this morning. I think something's going on. Just some of those little validating comments, even just a validating look, like, I see you, I believe you, I don't know what's going on, but I know that something's upsetting right now. There was no mention of that at all. It was such a stark finding. So this tool of emotion validation might be very powerful in terms of making it possible for us to remain in metacognitive conversations. If we're afraid to open up a metacognitive conversation and talk all about what might be hard about a task. If we're afraid to get into a conversation like this, because a student might say something a little bit salty. This was actually a bit of a sassy comment that this student made. The student said, "I don't even know what she's talking about." If we're afraid to open a metacognitive conversation because we don't want that kind of sassy comment kind of proliferating in our room, we don't want that kind of behavior expressed, then we're missing out on this opportunity to do this very feasible group metacognition. And so using emotion validation skills, this teacher can just say, "Oh yeah, it's so hard, isn't it? Sometimes our supply teachers don't know the way our classroom works." And I think we all feel that way sometimes. You just don't know what someone's talking about. It's a little overwhelming and confusing, isn't it? So we can actually not only move smoothly past that expression of frustration, but we can use that moment to build crucial emotion regulation skills in that student and all of our students who are listening in and learning this wonderful skill. So that is maybe a really crucial tool and how to deal with this frustration. The other problem that teachers raise is the issue of overwhelm. So we're having trying to have a conversation about a task. It's a challenging task. Maybe we've invited our students to complete 6 math questions independently. And we have maybe a conversation like this and there's not much participation. Or we have a conversation like this and then nobody really goes off and does anything different. And we don't really know why. I mean, this idea of overwhelm came out of some research that I did at a school to try to understand what was going on. Why are these students not able to participate meaningfully in a conversation like this? Why are they saying the same things every time? They would raise their hand and say, "Because I don't know, I'm distracted. It'll be too noisy in here." They would say the same kinds of things every time. So they weren't digging into these tasks and thinking carefully about exactly what would be challenging and exactly what they could do to be strategic. So we realized that it was overwhelm, and I want to explain why, and I want to explain the little tool that we developed to try to tackle that and fix it. So the whole project started, and I'm gonna just start out here by telling you about the research that I did. It started at one school, so I went and just was full-time there for 2 weeks. I was in and out of 3 different classrooms. There were 2 grade 3-4 classrooms and a 5-6. And I was spending every minute of the school day sitting in the back of those classrooms, maybe sitting with the students and trying to do some of their work or trying to lead some of these metacognitive conversations and getting a feel for how it was going. We took lots of video of what was happening with the students, collected some artifacts, including that math problem chart that you saw. We're trying to figure out what was going on. Why were the students not engaging? Why were they so distant? And why were they kind of hanging to the edge of the pool and not grabbing that challenge and working really hard and building their executive functions? So we started the research by thinking about Nancy Perry's research. So Nancy Perry has identified a wide range of factors that make it easier and for students to self-regulate. I want to share these factors. We actually had an artist, my friend Kay Lang, we had an artist draw pictures of these factors so we could talk to children about them. I want to zoom in on each of these 4 quadrants and all the factors that support self-regulated learning. But really, in this study, we were trying to figure out which of these, if these are all dials that we can crank up, which one do we need to crank up to make this group self-regulated learning work better? What more support do they need? Because something isn't working. So we know all of this stuff around sharing with students that their ideas count, giving them some choice, scaffolding to the zone of proximal development and giving lots of feedback. We know all those things allow students to take charge and feel autonomous and feel in control. We know that in order to stay on track, they need fun and interesting tasks, very clear instructions, easy to follow routines, and helpful reminders. We know that they probably need lots of help to understand exactly how to do a task, get good feedback, receive help when they need it, to talk about their learning and have some encouragement to succeed. And they need help to feel positive. They need a sense of teamwork with their class, and they need to share kind words. We need to make sure that everybody feels that they can succeed, and they need to be celebrated and encouraged when they succeed. When you think about it, a lot of those are already involved in that barriers and strategies conversation. So we couldn't figure out, does one of these qualities need to be really cranked up high? And if so, which one? How do we make this work? How do we better leverage all of these factors? And so I watched and tried to learn about what was going on. And I came up with a few interesting factors. The research team and the teachers isolated a few factors. And then at the end of the study, we ran all those factors by the students. So we actually wrote a book to share with the students, where we told the story of the research. And then we invited them to tell us if we got it right. And so in qualitative research, this is called member checking, where you check that with the people that you've been sort of researching, gathering data on, your research subjects. You actually touch base with them and do a whole second layer of research where you say, are we right? Have we got this right? What do you think? What did we miss? What can we add? And so I'm just going to share the book with you that I read to the students, because it captures this research study really nicely. So the book is called It Works. And this is on my website, actually, on the Activated Learning website, if you want to take a closer look. The second page is a whole introduction to the study, because we shared this book right away with all the parents at the school, and we wanted to give them enough information so that they were really well informed about what we did. So you can read these fine details if you access this book on my website. But let's begin the story. So once upon a time, there was a little school in Ontario. Its students were kind and helpful and hardworking. And just like any school, there were good days and less good days. There were interesting days and less interesting days. And these are all anonymized pictures of these classrooms. And there I am sitting in the back, just kind of watching. And sometimes I was sitting cross-legged on the floor with the students or helping teach. I had a lot of different roles. And this is a screen grab from my video camera. There were great days and less great days. It was a nice, normal school. Every day the teachers taught the kids, and most days the kids learned. Every day the teachers assigned some work, and most days the kids did it. But some days they didn't. Some days the learning and the work didn't get done. But not because the kids were bad. Nobody really thought that. It was something else. They were sure of it because the kids were great. They were funny and brilliant, creative, interested, kind, and caring. But sometimes the work didn't get done. And so the teachers had two good ideas for how to help. They knew that the kids needed to talk about their learning, and they knew that the kids needed to be told that their ideas counted. And so when they assigned hard work, they asked the kids to talk about their barriers and strategies. So the children were really familiar with this idea of barriers and strategies. They'd been doing lots of it in their classrooms. The teachers wanted them to be ready for anything, so they tried to help them imagine barriers and plan strategies. As the kids talked, they got better at school, and also the teachers learned a little more about what they needed. Their two clever ideas worked, mostly, kinda. Good job. Even though the barriers and strategies talks mostly kind of worked, the teachers wanted to know more. They wanted the kids to be ready for anything, so nothing could stop them. They wanted the kids to look into the future, to see all of the problems, pitfalls, and challenges they might face and figure out how to smash them like in a video game. They wanted the kids to win and succeed and be happy. They really cared about them. And here we're telling just this beautiful story of the relationship and how the teachers feel about the children. So every day the teachers got up in the dark, had a strong coffee, and came to school extra early. They had meetings to try to figure out how to make it easier for kids to have great barriers and strategies conversations. They loved it, mostly, kind of. And this is every day of the 2 weeks. These teachers came in 45 minutes early. I made them breakfast and we had a long recorded conversation about what we were learning. And this is how we identified these themes. They learned 5 important things, but they needed the kids to really understand, the kids to help to really understand the 5 things. So we said to the students, get ready to tell your part of the story. It's almost your turn. And here are the things that we learned. First idea, to predict the barriers and figure out strategies, kids need much clearer and simpler instructions than anyone realizes. They can't be strategic if they don't know what the heck they're trying to do. So to be clear, the teachers were giving pretty clear instructions. But as a person that was sitting in the back of the classroom, we would be ready to start our activity, or we would be starting a conversation. And one of the students would ask me, are we supposed to do the front and the back or just the back of this page? And most of the time I wouldn't know. And so what we realized is that those classrooms are incredibly distracting, and that the instructions that children receive, especially if we want them to be metacognitive about them and talk about them, they have to be so crystal clear, so much more crystal clear than anybody even realizes. Somehow we have to make it impossible for them to not know what they're supposed to be doing. And the students gave us a million examples of how we were on the money, and we really tightened up this theme and these findings based on what they said. Second thing is to have great barriers and strategies conversations. Kids needed to do the same kind of activities a few times so they could get in a groove and know what was going on and feel confident. This helped them to understand the task. So the more they felt like confident experts on what they were supposed to do, the more strategic they could be. So there's a real on-ramp where the very first time you introduce a task, it may be really difficult for students to be productively metacognitive because they don't even know what's going on yet. And so with a few practice runs, maybe the 3rd time we asked them to do a certain task, all of a sudden they had all kinds of ideas about how they could be strategic. So we should not be discouraged if students who are unfamiliar with the task were really hanging to the edge of the pool and not participating. They need to figure out what's going on. Another thing, this was huge, is the students needed the tasks to matter and count. So they needed to know if they met expectations or if they didn't at the end of the work period. Otherwise, they didn't really care about being strategic. This was so clear. All of the classrooms I was in had a very nurturing, kind, empathetic folder that said to be finished. And the rule was that if we got to the end of the work period and you weren't done, don't worry about it, just pop it in the to be finished folder. And this was trying to lower stress. It was very nurturing, to remove pressure, to reduce stigma around not succeeding. But what it did is it removed any sense that there was a target they were striving towards. So it was almost like they were engaging in a strategic conversation about like, how can I be successful? How can I hit the mark? But there was no mark. It was like they were playing darts and the dartboard was covered. And somebody was saying to them, how can you hit the bullseye? And there was no bullseye in sight. There was no specific goal and they never knew if they hit it. So from day to day, they didn't get that feedback. Yes, you succeeded, or just about. You didn't quite succeed today, but maybe tomorrow. And as soon as we started saying exactly what they were responsible for, suddenly they started trying to self-regulate towards the goal. This relied on a little bit of differentiation. It's relied on slightly different tasks for different students. So maybe taking those math questions and making 3 versions and giving certain students a version that the teacher was pretty sure they could succeed at. And when we did that, the students were coming to us saying, oh, I want to meet the expectation. I need to know another way to show 3 times 4. I only know 2 ways to show it, and I need to know a 3rd way in order to meet the expectations. All of a sudden, they were hungry for learning. They had come off the edge of the pool. They were swimming really hard, trying to use all of their executive functions and their school skills to meet that clear expectation. It was a big one. And they needed those expectations, again, to be super clear, small. Having a project that's meant to overlap over multiple classes was much less effective than saying our chunk for today is exactly this. You have exactly this amount of time. Everybody is capable of doing this. I've made sure you've all got the right task. Are you ready? Let's go. So it needed to be an achievable little chunk of time. So this was a really big discovery. These discoveries were pretty big and important. But I worked with then another school board, actually took the results of this study and went to another school board and talked all about it. And we developed this little tool. This is a tool that can be put on a whiteboard or like a template that goes on a whiteboard that you can just write into. And when you assign a task, it's just a good structure for your accountability as a teacher, but also to do that crystal clear statement of goals that are achievable. And so this idea that you can just force yourself every time you want students to be productive, you have a period of time and you want them off the edge of the pool and swimming hard, you state a really crystal clear specific goal and you make yourself accountable to making it quantified. How many of exactly what does it look like? Make sure they know exactly what they're responsible for. Make sure they know when it's due, how much time they have. So this is a lot of like looking at the clock. It's 11:15 now. We're going to have 20 minutes to do this. This is how many minutes on the time timer. Can we all commit to that? And then getting them to commit, asking them, checking in and saying, is this possible? Does this make sense? Can we do it? If not, let's change the goal. But we've all got to agree to this right now. So let's figure out something that we can agree to. And then saying, all right, okay, well, what might stop you? Just 2 things. What might your barriers be? And what strategies are you going to use? And then these barriers and strategies conversations were a lot more engaged, busy, full, rich, because the students knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing. And they were using a familiar template. So day after day, students using this template, beginning to know this is the structure of the pedagogy for today. This is what I can expect. And then at the end, making sure that students got feedback as to whether they achieved their goal. This was as easy as putting out 2 different bins and saying to everyone, you all know what the expectation was. Here's the met expectation bin. Here's the didn't quite meet it bin. You have to choose, you have to declare and notice if you hit it or if you didn't. And of course it's okay if you didn't. We're going to talk about what we'll do next time. And so taking a moment, just a little conclusion at the end to say what worked and what didn't quite work today and what might we try next time. And this is a fully complete cycle of self-regulated learning, and you get in the hang of doing it, and it cleans up a lot of those big problems. So that's the end of the content I have to share. So to sum up, we kind of talked about this challenge of achieving goals at school and how these processes of group socially shared learning regulation can be a really feasible way to provide the nurturing and the scaffolding. But we identified and sort of troubleshot these 2 problems that you might have along the way. The big idea here is that if you want to provide challenges in school and use nurturing and scaffolding to build strong executive functions so they can tackle novel ideas and novel challenges and have all this success, we can, in a normal Ontario school, use this nice, feasible, socially shared approach, this barriers and strategies approach. Any teacher can do it. But we need to make sure we use two important inclusive practices, and there are probably more, but these are the big ideas so far. That we must have skills for handling emotion if we want to open metacognitive spaces that students feel safe in. And we must have skills for handling their overwhelm in order to make this work. And especially for students with learning disabilities, we need this highly structured, clear, explicit support to handle the feelings of overwhelm. So that's the gestalt. How do you like that slide, Stephen? Pretty fancy. And that's the end. And I'm available for questions now. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laurie. I'm just going to have a place. Thank you so much, Laurie, for that powerful, incredibly thoughtful presentation. You've given us so much to reflect on, from the emotional side of executive skills to the importance of clarity, scaffolding, and student voice. The Barriers and Strategies protocol in particular offers such a practical way to support students in naming what's getting in their way and co-constructing meaningful strategies. A shift that can make a real difference and validate students, especially those with learning disabilities and ADHD. I know many of us are already thinking about how to bring these ideas into our classrooms, which I'm thinking about how to bring these into a classroom with pre-service teachers. We have a few questions lined up that dive a little bit deeper into the experience of students with learning disabilities and ADHD and how we as educators can support their metacognitive growth. Let's start with the first one. In most classrooms, educators are supporting students with diagnosed or undiagnosed LDs and ADHD.
Yeah.
What's something you hope teachers will start seeing differently when it comes to how these students show up in learning?
That's such a great question, Stephen. I think after all of my reading and thinking about this emotion validation piece, I go into schools and I look at children and I feel like I'm seeing them with totally different eyes. And I'm seeing that really almost everything that we might interpret as a behavior, as like an unhelpful, unwanted, sometimes unproductive or disruptive behavior, is actually an emotion trying to find expression. It gives me a lot of hope that if we could start doing this work of emotion validation more regularly, that we actually might see less aggressive behaviors and we might hear more emotional language. We might hear students doing that. I feel frustrated, that I feel angry. I feel really disappointed by X, Y, Z. And then I think our task is to get comfortable in those conversations, to get comfortable with the process of not taking it personally. Even if it is, I feel frustrated that you were away all last week, Stephen. You and I saw students talking like that in some of the research that we did together. And being able to stay in our professional role and say, my job right now is not to think about feeling defensive. My job right now is to say something like, wow, yeah, of course that's hard. School can be really disorganized. I mean, it's hard for everything to remain consistent. I'm not surprised you feel overwhelmed and frustrated. That's so hard. And I think if we could just see through the behaviors to the emotions, we have so much to gain. We have so much wonderful progress to look forward to, so much harmony and relationship and closeness. And yeah, great question.
Thank you for that. And when I hear you listen to your research, I always have that feeling of like, oh, if I could always go back, if I could only go back, not only as an educator, but even as a parent, how might I have done different things differently if I would have known some of this information back then. So
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah,
Another question, you emphasize that clarity and empathy can unlock metacognition.
yeah.
Why are those two elements especially important for students with LDs and ADHD?
Well, I think the more you talk to students with LD and ADHD, and I mean at every level, I am the student success coordinator now for APHD for the Department of Applied Psychology and Human Development. New role, very excited. I'm about a month in. But every student that I talk to who's having difficulty at the graduate level is talking about the same sort of things that our students with LDs and ADHD are talking about in school. So first of all, important thing to know, there are so many students with learning disabilities in higher education doing amazing work, but they do need support still around these feelings of overwhelm and these feelings of frustration. It's the same thing. This need for crystal clear instructions, and an acknowledgement that they feel frustration and that they're overwhelmed and that they're disappointed. Often there's an undue administrative burden in what they're trying to do that doesn't feel fair and unjust. And it's so striking to me how it's the same all the way through. It's the same sorts of problems. And you can see that even though they have these hallmark challenges, these students with learning disabilities, ADHD, are often the students who are doing the most important work. They are so filled with relevant life experience and insight and motivation and passion. And so I just think it's the more we can do to help them build skills, to find clarity in tasks. I think having that routine of using that work plan, I think that's something they can internalize in elementary school and bring to high school and bring to higher learning. And that those processes of doing emotion validation, they can internalize that and learn to validate themselves in their next steps and in their transitions. It's just such an important thing to work on. And in my one-on-one meetings with these very highly qualified, brilliant students, I feel like I'm pulling out the exact same tools. I'm teaching them how to validate their own emotions, and I'm teaching them how to break down what they need to do and find calm, structure, clarity. So these are life skills, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so exciting to be thinking about, you've been talking about, working in the primary grades, and it really empowers students and can transform their trajectory because they're taking those skills onward even to graduate studies,
Yeah.
as you're doing now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So many students with LDs have internalized a sense of failure. How can we use the barriers and strategies protocol, or even just the spirit of it, to help rebuild student agency and confidence?
That's a great question. That reminds me of maybe 15 or even 20 years ago in the classroom, working in a congregated setting with lots of students who were coming in from other places where they had been very unsuccessful, coming in with a lot of shame, but also coming in with a lot of unacknowledged feelings that looked a lot like aggression and frustration. These were kids that kind of swaggered into the room like a hero in an action movie with like an explosion behind them, and they would literally say things to me like, "You don't even know what's about to happen in this room," or "Get ready, you're about to meet me." And in higher learning, I had a student walk in and say those words to me literally as well. "You have no idea. Get ready. You're about to meet your maker." And what they were essentially saying is, "I'm terrible at school and you're probably going to hate me." And so in doing the barriers and strategies with a student like that, it was really a beautiful thing to see the transformation, because the first thing it did for this particular student was to give him really lots of clarity on exactly what he could do next. And so the student may not have been able to handle the assignment. There may be something that was challenging about the assignment, or they know they're not going to be great at reading. And even though they've got a differentiated material, it's still going to be really hard. But they did know that in our conversation, they were the person to come up with a really, really cool strategy that everyone in the classroom was then going to give a try and explore. And suddenly there was this renewed feeling of competence. I'm highly resourceful. I have great ideas for strategies. I know how to hack this assignment. And so really it's a focus on a student's assets. It opens a space where students can tell us, what assets do you bring to this learning? We're not going to talk about your disability for a hot second. We're going to talk about all the cool ways that you can be strategic and adaptive, that you can self-advocate. And so just opening a lane to start practicing that self-advocacy in the classroom made a big difference. And then at the end of the engagement, I could be talking about, how did you do today? Number one, how did you do on whatever the core assignment was? Did you meet up? Did your strategies get you to a place where you met the expectation? And did you use your strategies? Because I was looking for that as well. So then I can be giving feedback and celebrating not only academic achievement, but I can be celebrating achievements in problem solving, adaptability, self-advocacy, self-knowledge, self-awareness. Oftentimes they were helping other students. So there's interesting research that once you get that vibe going, that sort of can-do, open-minded, growth-focused, asset-focused vibe going, you can almost step back as an educator, because the students will internalize that optimism and that empowerment and start motivating each other, start helping each other. And I remember in my last days in the classroom, I would just stand in the door. People were walking by and looking in and whatever, and I would just stand there kind of like this, like, look at them, like, just look at how incredible they are. Yeah, totally awesome. Teaching and learning, I think, can be totally awesome.
Yeah, and it's really awesome. You talk about that student walking in and just that swagger, and you've never met someone like me. And the interesting thing is that it is potentially just a simple response from the educator that's validating, that can be, you've never met someone like me, perhaps because I'm going to validate you. I'm going to be
Yeah,
providing opportunities for you to be thinking
yeah,
differently about
yeah.
yourself and how you engage.
Oh, that's beautiful, Stephen. It's true. That's the perfect response. Well, guess what? You may not have ever met someone like me. So let's go.
So we know that emotional regulation is often a challenge for students with LDs and ADHD. What's something teachers can do in that moment that supports regulation without sacrificing the flow in the class?
Yeah, this is such a common question. Teachers are always worried about the calm and the flow, and that tripartite model where, my gosh, when something bubbles up, teachers aren't just thinking about that one student, it's themselves. I mean, they have to very carefully manage their own emotion regulation and the rest of the class, which there it's like a lightning rod for emotion and the student. Talk a lot about the idea of micro validation being powerful, just as powerful as a micro invalidation, which is just an ignore. Just a moment of, and sometimes it's all the student can handle, just a moment of like acknowledgement, just, I see you, or, whew, wow, that looks hard. There's a lot of body language within the how to list, mirroring, like, ugh, sorry, wow, but just avoiding that thing that we were all taught, which is only pay attention to the positive behaviors, because you end up neglecting and denying and ignoring a lot of legitimate emotion. That's one thing. And then I think also it's like paying attention to your own emotions with the most powerful tools, which are getting into the habit of validating yourself. Teachers, especially Ontario, especially Canadian, we're told, let's get her done, like, buck up, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. This is how I was raised. And Stephen, I know it is how you were raised too, knowing a few things about you. We're like can-do people. But I think, especially for Canadian teachers all over the place, it's important for us to actually just be willing to take a moment and say, of course, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. Anyone would be overwhelmed. Of course, maybe I'm feeling abandoned right now. Maybe I'm feeling abandoned by my system, and I'm feeling legitimately scared right now. Anybody would. And this really allows us to come back into regulation, emotional comfort. It's okay to say those things. I think people all through the system, we need to learn that that is emotion validation. We are not saying that we're going to dismantle the system. We're not saying we're going to quit. We're not saying we're not going to do the science of learning and the science of reading. We're just saying, yeah, we have some legitimate emotions and we are skillful professionals and we know how to handle them by taking a moment to validate how we're all feeling. So I think that's huge.
Thank you. It's just, it's awesome the way you always bring together your years and years of experience and the latest research, including your own. Thank you, Dr. Laurie Faith, for such a thoughtful, practical presentation. Today, you've helped us see how executive skills aren't just cognitive, they're deeply emotional, relational, and shaped by the environments we create. You reminded us that clarity and empathy aren't soft add-ons. They're essential teaching tools that make strategy use and self-regulation possible, especially for students with LDs and ADHD. From validation to scaffolding to the powerful naming of barriers out loud. You've given us language and tools that educators can bring into the classrooms tomorrow, not just to help students manage school, but to help them see themselves differently. On behalf of the LDO team, thank you again, Laurie, and thanks to everyone who joined us. We hope you'll carry these insights forward as we continue working to create classrooms where all learners can thrive.
Oh, and thank you so much, Stephen, for your wonderful facilitation. It's such an honor to be platformed on LD at school and to work in this amazing province with so many incredible teachers. So I'm so proud of all that we've accomplished, and I just can't wait for the next steps that we'll all take together. Thank you.